Well, hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development, our weekly podcast where we talk about all the big headlines in global. And this is a special week, of course, because we're in New York for UN General Assembly. This is the week when the global development community, the humanitarian world, the sustainability world, social impact leaders of all kinds descend on this town, causing traffic snarls, hundreds of side events. And it's an amazing week with a lot going on. So I've got the best person to talk about this week with, which is Colum Lynch, our senior global reporter here at Devex, is based in New York, covers all things UN. How's this week going for you, Colum?
A little bit of sensory overload, but it's going pretty well. I mean, it's sort of interesting. Once again, the last few General Assemblies have been really focused on sustainable development goals. That's been, the idea that there needs to be sort of more of a focus on that than sort of some of the traditional conflict issues. But as every General Assembly, life kind of, interrupts the plan, and we have a whole series of conflicts underway across the globe, particularly Lebanon blowing up, kind of becoming the focus of conversation there, sort of eclipsing a lot of the other issues. The Americans and the French last night negotiated a proposal for a ceasefire in Lebanon. Looks like the Israelis aren't really buying it, at least
Mhm.
as we see this morning. Some interesting stuff with the new Iranian president sending some kind of love notes to the Americans about the prospect of maybe reopening the nuclear, the negotiations on a nuclear deal that were, everybody remembers were shut down during the Trump administration. So like a lot of stuff happening, but they did get through the key objectives, which were to adopt a pact for the future,
Yeah.
a little digital pact. It was messy, but they got to the finishing line. So now it's
Yeah,
going to be
it's
all implementation.
right. It's hard to talk about something like the Pact for the Future when you've got an active war happening in multiple places around the world and people are ramping up. But I did notice on the sidelines and all the conversations we've been having, there has been some sense of optimism around the fact that, even with all the pushback from Russia and some of its allies, that they got it through, that there's some ambition in it. And it kind of gives a little bit of a push to the idea that, the UN does have a big role to play here in kind of laying out a framework beyond just the SDGs, but for where the global development community ought to be focused and working, and that you can find places to cooperate. So there's some sense of optimism, I think, that came out of it. But for people who weren't tuning in much, you say the implementation is kind of important. Like, what would it really mean if they can implement this pact for the future?
Well, I mean, this UN Secretary General begins with a quite ambitious, I mean, the way things work at the UN begins with a pretty ambitious sort of vision of what role he wants the UN to play. He wants them to be more involved and in touch with the sort of future issues like AI, governance in AI, sort of ability to try and regulate some sort of semblance of kind of of taking some of the chaos out of internet and social media and that sort of thing. So there are those kinds of issues. A notion that the UN has kind of stuck in its structures in the Second World War. So there's been a big push on the expansion of the Security Council, particularly the idea that there should be African representation. Many of these governments, were under colonial rule during the founding of the organization, so that's seen as a historical wrong that needs to be righted. So that's an important thing. I mean, a really big issue is that this kind of, puts more pressure to bring issues, discussions, debates about the reform of the international financial architecture closer to the UN, where it's a more democratic body. A lot of the donors have resisted that, particularly the United States, wanting to keep the conversations really focused, decision making in the multilateral development banks and the IMF and the World Bank. So the Europeans, the Americans have had to make concessions. I mean, there's a real focus on trying to bridge the gap in terms of geopolitically between the donors and the global South. A lot of disruption over, in light of the COVID-19, pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
the crisis of indebtedness. So there's sort of a feeling, lack of money for climate change remediation. So there's a sense that the donors have to deliver, and financially and money. And so a lot of the commitments are kind of, sort of leaning in that direction. I mean, I'll give you one example at the beginning, before this week, for the last couple of years, this UN Secretary General has really been pushing for this idea of creating some sort of, $500 billion a year kind of, sustainable development goals stimulus. I mean, this would be, not money the governments would put, would give, the international community 500 billion, but it would be like a collection of private investment, government, support, domestic investment, and all that. And the Americans very early on tried to shoot it down, weren't able to kill it off entirely. But if you look at the document, it doesn't have a number, but it sort of hints at, it sort of suggests that we need to look at the SG's, the Secretary General's proposal. And then once the event was over, of course, Antonio Guterres came out and made another plug for, the fund. So, so a lot of this is sort of, it's inching towards these issues that we've all been focused on, finance, climate, all these things. Moves the ball a bit, but this is always a work in progress. There will be, there's going to be a COP, summit. There'll be more G7s, G20s, and all these issues will continue to play out.
It's a fascinating dynamic because obviously you've got the geopolitical tension, Russia and China increasingly close, but really with their own interests as well. The US and the West, of course, the US, Europe together in many ways, but also have their own interests, including on issues like climate. And then the global South, which you've reported a lot on, has so much distrust for the system now and feels, particularly after the COVID experience and not getting access to vaccines, like, these international organizations, are they really set up to serve us? And is this really a fair system? To me, one of the takeaways from Pact for the Future, and you started to get into it, is that in the end, the place where most of the action is are the DFIs. It's the multilateral development banks, it's the development finance institutions. Ultimately, the Secretary General can make big pronouncements about $500 billion. Ultimately, the instruments where there's a lot of activity and potential are these MDBs because they're already capitalized.
Right.
They already have a mandate. They have a structure that allows shareholders, including, countries that don't see eye to eye, like China and the US,
Right.
to be a part of it. And they're really moving. They're growing. They're growing their balance sheets. They're, reforming, maybe not as fast as they need to, but there is a big push there. And so I think there's even an element of the Pact for the Future, which gets into the DFIs playing a bigger role in peace building. We
Right.
talked about that last night on stage at Devex. So, to me, it just cements more and more the role of the DFIs, which is probably not what the SG wants. He'd like to see the UN more in the center of the action, but I think in many ways, it's the MDBs and the DFIs.
Right.
I've had many people talk to me on the sidelines here mentioning, well, we'll be in DC for the World Bank annual meetings in a few weeks. Like that's where, like, this is just the precursor to that. That's becoming a more and
Right.
more important locus for activity.
Right. I mean, listen to the US kind of talking notes and strategy for the last several years. It's been very much, they feel this pressure at the UN and among like in the global South. And so they have had to talk a good game on reform of the international financial architecture, but, a reform that is centered in in these institutions. And so, they will, in some ways, the rhetoric will not be that much different in Washington than it is in New York, but it means quite different things, in terms of, who makes the decision where power resides. And so that's kind of interesting. But I think there's also this other dynamic, which is, why does the United States, why do the Europeans, why do the others who carry so much about, who are more concerned generally the UN about security issues, why do they care about this, these kind of protests from the South? And you see it in terms of, how they position themselves on security issues. So, the other coin of this conversation about international financial, reform of the financial, system is, who backs Ukraine? Where do you stand on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So, everybody's in a game of winning hearts and minds. And I mean, in part, like in the negotiation on the future pact, the European Union were getting very strong instructions from their leaderships that you guys need to make a deal. You need to find some way to get through this and to make a deal that, makes, the global South feel like they got something out of it. And I think, the US was, a little more hardline, a little
Hmm.
tougher on this issue. And so it isolated them to a certain degree. I mean, they really, if they don't have the rest of the West with them, or they're kind of leaning in the other direction, even though they kind of have similar interests, they want the same thing. But I mean, I always had the sense that the priority on reaching a deal with the global South was, more of a little bit more of a priority for the Europeans.
That makes a lot of sense to me, in part because, for the Europeans, but also for the US, there's the meta reason to make sure this pact for the future worked, which is that it's kind of the legitimacy of the UN on the line, right? In the end, this pact may not have that many teeth in it. And implementation, as you said right at the outset, that's the big question. Can they deliver on sort of the ambitions in it? But if the UN couldn't get this through, if the SG couldn't get it through, I mean, the signal it would send about the relevance of this institution would be really damaging. And I think European leaders and others have sort of realized this is a moment we've got to at least bolster the sense of relevance of the institution. And yeah, we might move on to the World Bank annual meetings. A lot of the action might happen elsewhere, but we have to show that this institution matters and it can change for the times,
Right.
even if that change is much slower than the rest of the world would want to see. Hey, listen, I know we could talk about this topic forever, but the UNGA week is also a time when so many other announcements are made. I want to hear if there's any that you heard this week or that we've covered that are interesting to you. And one that pops out for me is this whole issue of lead exposure. We've got a good story on that. We had it on our stage earlier this week, but USAID, the Gates Foundation, a number of other partners came together backing a big initiative. In fact, Jill Biden was there speaking on it, kind of a star-studded event, but on this idea of how do you reduce lead exposure for children in low and middle income countries. It's an issue that's been pushed primarily by a group that may not be as well known to our audience, and that's Open Philanthropies, the philanthropy of Carrie Tuna and Dustin Moskowitz, based out of Silicon Valley. They are well known as effective altruists, so they're always looking for like, what is that thing everyone else has missed, where it's super important, but we could actually move it. And they've been measuring and studying this issue for a while, and they had a big announcement this week. They're going to be pushing on lead exposure, and it's one of these areas where I hate to call it a silver bullet, but it looks like the kind of thing where if you could make real progress on it, you could make tremendous progress on children's health, kind of outsized progress on children's health all around the world. So that was a big story I heard people in the global health community talking about this week.
Right. So this is what I mean by sensory overload, right? So the UN, the UN, they're dealing with everything from sexual rights to international global taxation to sea level rise to the peaceful uses of outer space. So you run the gamut. But I mean, like let's take for instance, like I didn't follow the lead issue, I confess, but say on antimicrobial resistance, right? So that's another issue where there was sort of an indication that there would be somewhere, I think it was $100 million number in the final draft. But
And I think it's today, right?
yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
high level meeting on AMR is today.
Yeah, so I mean that's an issue where I mean even for me, we had a piece earlier in the week on it on our news site that the expected deaths and mortality rate from antimicrobials is surpassing malaria, HIV, all these other infectious diseases that we've been battling for decades to kind of come to terms with, and so that's an issue that is really on people's minds and has been a big focus. There's another one. I mean, there was a big high level meeting yesterday on sea level rise. And there's an interesting sort of anecdote about this, which is at the beginning of the year, the UN put out a note saying, we're in this liquidity crisis and all these meetings go on too long. And, you guys want to do a high level meeting on sea level rise, which of course is about climate change and is an incredibly important issue. But we don't know if we have we have the cash to do it. And And we're going to have to think about that. We won't be able to pay salaries and that sort of thing. And then just in the lead up to the high level meeting this week, the Secretary General's Chief of Staff, Courtney Rete, put out a statement basically saying, "Okay, we're going to lift the ceiling and we're going to cover all the meetings." And the meeting went across anyways. So there's sort of interesting things going on that side as well.
Yeah, no, there are. And yeah, the AMR one you bring up, it's a good one because it's a classic sort of tragedy of the commons problem. And it's exactly why the UN is here, because this is not something any one country can address. This is, an
Right,
issue that has to be addressed globally. It's the kind of thing where, especially in the agriculture industry, it's really easy to overuse cheap antibiotics. It doesn't really impact you much.
right,
You save some money. And so unless you have a strong regulatory regime across many regions, unless industry is part of it, there's so many things you've got to do to stitch this together that it does make sense for a UN. So for all the skeptics, and you hear skeptics even here on the streets of New York during UNGA week, you kind of need the UN to step up on something like AMR. And it's a big deal that they made it one of their high level meetings this year, that they made they're putting a big marker down on this. I think the last one was 2016 on AMR. So I talked to some industry leaders who are hoping that this will spur, it'll provide the impetus for some more regulatory action
right,
at the national level. And you'll see countries and industry groups start to kind of step up a little bit more because it just raises the attention as well as some money that gets,
right.
put together because of this moment.
I mean, the whole point of this session, and you hear the really depressing, sort of almost apocalyptic speeches by the Secretary General over the last few years about how multilateralism is stuck. It doesn't work. They can't do conflict resolution, which was one of the core, tasks that the UN was, assigned after the Second World War. The Council is deeply divided. You have a lot of problems, and the UN needs to demonstrate that they're useful. And these various efforts, and often on issues which people aren't really paying attention to, but which, are really kind of vital areas that impact the lives of, billions of people. That they're making progress on those issues. So, whether it be climate, whether it be these health issues. So you see the health issues becoming more prominent. I mean, last year, I think there were three high-level meetings on issues of health, but they're in a struggle to convince themselves and the rest of the world that they are relevant and that they can do important things. And so, you don't see them playing that role on the peace front, right? So you don't see Antonio Guterres. He's not, hanging out with Blinken in Egypt and, and Qatar, and, he's not present in the negotiation on peace efforts, but he's carved out areas where the UN could be useful, and that is generally he sees that as kind of focusing more of their mission on humanitarian response, whether that's in the Ukraine, whether that's in Gaza, whether that's in Sudan. So the idea is that, I mean, there was a lot of criticism of this in, not unsurprisingly from Javier Milei, I don't know if you heard his speech, but Milei's
I
speech,
didn't.
which, yeah, I mean, it was really funny because you had the traditional left. It's hard to see everybody as kind of fitting into these boxes, but Russia, Venezuela, and Nicaragua all denouncing the future summit, and, in a sense, trying to block it. And then you see, a kind of free market libertarian like Millet attacking the future summit from another angle as being this collective Marxist project, that is going to bring, harm to everybody in the way that it has in his own country.
Sort of
So,
like a world government approach, right? That he doesn't want to see.
exactly, a leftist project.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. It's fascinating to see how these, and you mentioned this, the SG doesn't hang out with Blinken negotiating peace in the Middle East. But a lot of that, I think, is what we talked about at the top, which is just the geopolitical realities. If you don't have the backing of the permanent members of the Security Council, if you've got a different view between the global south, what they want to see, what China wants to see, what the Russia and its allies want to see, what the US wants to see. It's very tough to play this mediator role when the main powers don't really want you to. They don't want you
Right.
at the table. And so you're right. I think the SG has been forced into a position to find other places where he can act. And in part, this Pact for the Future was that sort of legacy moment for him because he only
Right.
has, what, a year left, I think, right?
Yeah.
In his
Yeah. Yeah.
term.
Well, he's got, yeah, he's, no, no, it's going to be end of 26 is when he
Okay,
steps down.
but I guess
The campaign
the
is
campaign
starting
is
now.
starts in earnest,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
already talk, and people hear buzzing about this on the streets of New York about, well, who's gonna end up in that position. I know you've done a little bit of reporting on this. I guess it's likely to be someone because of the regional preferences. It's likely to be someone from Latin America and the Caribbean. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, although it was supposed to be someone from Latin American Caribbean last time, and Guterres got it, and it was supposed to be a woman last time, and Guterres got it. So that's, I mean, I had a conversation with Maria Fernandez Espinosa last week, who was the defense and foreign minister of Ecuador, and she's kind of, like in the conversation, and I tried to get her to admit it. And she said, well, I haven't decided yet. I'm kind of giving a thought, but she's part of a campaign. She's leading a campaign to try and ensure that it's a female candidate who ends up getting the job. So nobody wants to say it, but it's also, it's a little risky to put your name out too early because then you become the focus of attacks. Like, I mean, someone that everybody's been talking about, Mia Motley, probably one of the great orators of our time, really focused on a lot of the issues on financial reform that we've been focusing on. Um, and yet, um, you know, she's not from a Spanish speaking country, so that sort of plays into the whole mix. And also, while U.S. Leaders Biden might like to have a photo op with her, I really wonder whether the United States would want someone who's such a champion of a financial kind of reform that it doesn't really buy into, and someone who is really kind of focused on sort of the divisions between the North and the South. So, there are all sorts of calculations that you have to wonder about. And do they find the least controversial person and not the most kind of dynamic? But it's going to be an interesting race,
Definitely.
nonetheless.
I mean, speaking of races, the other unstated thing, of course, for people who aren't here in New York and just want to get a sense of the feel here, everybody will talk about their issue. They'll explain how, it's the most important thing and they're working on it. They've got this progress, this innovation. And then there's the stated or unstated, but let's see what happens in November because there is, the US presidential
Right,
election is casting such a pall over all of these plans and the UN itself, just given as we've reported at Devex, the realities of what a Trump administration, if it were to come to pass, would mean for multilateralism, right? That
right,
obviously a lot depends on the makeup of Congress, but the truth is, it seems like the Trump administration would move in a direction of dramatically cutting America's investments in multilateral organizations writ large, and that they would have the power to do that from the executive branch. And
right, right,
and so that's, I've talked to some UN agency heads this week. I've talked to some multilateral development bank heads. There's real fear. Everybody's up for replacements right now. Everyone's in fundraising mode. Many of the vertical funds, many of the DFIs, and there's just a sense of, wow, we're doing our best. We have a plan. We got a strategy, but so much depends on what happens this fall.
right. So if you go back to the Trump administration, every single year, the budget from the White House had massive sweeping, cuts in everything, right? Development assistance, humanitarian aid, UN, everything was cut back to the bone. And yet it never happened because Congress would not allow it. But you know, the Republican Party has shifted,
Oh, and
and
don't forget
the
there were exceptions to that, right? Like in other words, they were
right,
able to cut UNFPA. They were able to
right,
cut the Green Climate Fund. They were able to cut UNESCO, right? The executive
right, right,
branch
right,
does have a lot of that power. And last time around, they were picking and choosing the most politically salient areas of
right.
the multilateral world to cut from. And the question is this time, will they be as selective or, maybe they will actually be much more aggressive in cutting some of the things that are seen as just core multilateral functions. And they have, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but from some of the people I've spoken to, I get the sense that the executive branch does have a lot of power to
Right.
slow down and stop spending, even when the funding has been appropriated for Congress, when
Yeah.
it's to these kind of multilateral institutions.
Yeah, and also I think they like the sort of whole, universe around him, they understand more what they need to do and what failed last time. So I would expect there would be more competence in their effort to try and, impose these deep cuts. I mean, like you said, everybody's focused on the election. I mean, it was kind of interesting. I mean, look, Iran is causing a lot of, trouble in the Middle East. It's financing all of these proxies, Hezbollah in Iraq, militias in Iraq, the who have been bombing the Israelis and disrupting commercial sea vessels and all that. But the message they sent was, in this meeting, the president was like, I want to fix the relationship with the West and with the US. And to me, it seemed like that was probably a signal to Kamala Harris that should she win, let's talk. So that's kind of, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like this whole thing, sort of played out like that. Like I think everybody, well, most of the people are just in the sort of waiting, playing a waiting game, and hoping that. I mean, I think pretty broad agreement that most of the UN would like her to win, except for Russia, which I mean, there's one thing we didn't mention earlier, but I just want to go back to like Russia, you know, usually if you're going to blow something up at the UN and Russia tried to blow up the Pact of the Future, you can kind of get away with it if you're Russia, China, if it's a battle between you and the Americans or a battle between you and the West, right? But you can't really do it if it involves like big, regional groups like the Africa group, the Asia group, Latin American group, maybe a little more flexibility there, but with the African group, because they have big, big numbers in the UN world and all that. And it's really important for their kind of geopolitical, standing. But, the Russians got trounced. I mean, after, they, said that after they, criticized the agreement, said that they weren't in consensus. The Africa group came out and just said, this is a good deal, and rejected, basically rejected, the Russians. I mean, the Russians were totally isolated. They had a couple of countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, the usual
I think there are
suspects.
like seven
Um,
countries in total, right?
yeah,
Against like
because
190 something.
yeah, because this deal, like a lot of countries in the G77, I mean, I talked to Ambassador G77, and they were like, there's a lot of good stuff in it in this for us, and we don't want to blow it up. And one of the things sort of in terms of looking towards the future is that after the vote, the deputy foreign minister came out and basically said, we don't accept this deal, and we're going to not, it will not allowed to be referred to in any other UN. So basically they're saying we're going to fight tooth and nail to undermine this thing everywhere we can. And they have a lot of power in places like, the UN fifth committee, which is the budget committee, when, a lot of this stuff is not funded and has to be funded and has to go through the budget committee. And they have a lot of power and levers that they can use. So it's going to be a big, big fight on that front.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And some of these things, the geopolitical contests, the U.S. election, they just kind of overshadow everything else. But nonetheless, this week there is so much happening. I mean, there were other announcements I'm just thinking of as we wrap up. CEPI announced, that's a Coalition for Pandemic Preparedness, Coalition
Yeah.
for Pandemic Preparedness. I forget now exactly what the logo is, but they focus on developing the next generation vaccines for future pandemics. And CEPI announced a major biosecurity initiative this week. There's a lot of controversy over the possibility that there was a lab leak that caused COVID-19.
Right.
These guys have come out now and said we have a big program that they put forward. This There was a lot of focus this week on nutrition. So the Gates Foundation hosted their annual Goalkeepers event. Bill Gates wrote his annual letter, and the big focus was childhood nutrition. We had Kerry Fowler on our stage at Devex, and he made the point that we can no longer think about this in terms of food security. It's got to be nutrition security now, because the reality is that if you don't think with the climate shifting about the kinds of crops that will succeed and will fail, you could end up with maybe enough calories, but not enough nutrition. And so he's really trying to get our community to think differently about soil health and about climate adaptive crops. So they've got a whole initiative in his part of the State Department. So nutrition was another big theme I heard quite a bit about this week. So there's a lot going on at all the levels of
Right.
UNGA
Well,
week.
yeah, I mean, this gets to the point that there are now basically two UN General Assemblies, right? And that the civil society is kind of moving ahead. And, I focus a lot on the building and all of its dysfunction, right? But all of these issues that they debate, civil society, private groups, they're just moving ahead. I mean, it's almost like the debate over, climate change during the Trump administration in the United States, where you had states like California were kind of marching ahead and advancing, kind of more renewable energies, whereas, the Trump administration was quite resistant, right? And so you see that playing out. And one of the interesting things in the debates over the Future Summit was that really, one of the things that really caused enormous consternation among the spoilers, Pakistan, Russia, others, was this notion that what the Secretary General was trying to do was bring these people, in a sense, across First Avenue into the building. That, this is really this idea that we can't deal with the future without having tech people, without dealing with AI, and we don't know it well enough. We need these experts, and we need them sort of inside the building. They're setting up for AI. There's a plan to set up, out of the Global Digital Compact, a panel and to have like, annual discussions on these issues, and to have like an advisory board. And so, you countries like, Russia and Pakistan were basically say, no, this is our house, right? This is a governmental body, and we don't want, and we're really not comfortable with all these people coming in. We don't want to cede our power to, to outsiders. So that's like, it's a really interesting thing. But, I mean, I'm in the building most of the time, but our other reporters are, not in there, and other news agencies. They're at the, the Clinton events, the Clinton Foundation events. They're at the Concordia. That there are all these other events, and they're drawing a lot of attention, more and more attention away from, the speaking head and the talking heads at the UN General Assembly. So
Yeah, in part because that's where a lot of the action is. Speaking of which,
yeah,
we probably have to wrap up because you got to get back to the hallways, and
yeah, yeah,
I've got
yeah,
to get back to the Devex summit. We're on our day 4 today of Devex's
yeah.
events here. We get some of the blame for contributing to all the million events that are happening outside the UN. But we'll be talking
And
today.
the gridlock,
And the
and the
gridlock.
gridlock.
I'll be interviewing Mafalda Duarte, who's, of course, the head of the Green Climate Fund, Ankur Vora, the chief strategy officer at the Gates Foundation. We have a lot happening over there today, and so tune in if you're listening to this. And there's so much content on our site. If you want to get like a little bit of a dose of optimism, check out the article on the Earthshot Prize finalists. I was reading that this morning, and I saw there's one of the finalists that is using whiskey barrels and getting like a whiskey byproduct to make a
Right.
fish oil alternative. There's all kinds of exciting stuff. And these are the kinds of folks you meet here on the sidelines of UNGA week. It is a mad week. It's just intense. So many people are here, but it's so relevant for our community. And so if you're interested in this kind of content, subscribe, of course, to the Devex Newswire, where you can see everything Colum's writing, everything our whole reporting team here in New York is writing, and get up to speed on all things UNGA. So with that, this has been another episode of This Week in Global Development. Great to talk to you, Colum.
All right. Good to talk to you, Rod. Thanks much.